Thanks, Pat. Well, luckily I have a lot of help to help me with all those hats that we keep up in the air. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to have the opportunity to talk a little bit about how the North Central Texas Council of Governments in the Dallas-Fort Worth region has utilized some of our planning processes to mainstream TSMO into what we do on a daily basis, from planning to programming to operations. We really try to utilize it in every area and get those folks engaged at every level along the way. So this first, I'm going to focus a lot on the data that we use to help us identify what transportation needs are out there, that then we help to identify solutions. And many of the solutions that fall within the area that I work in at COG are TSMO solutions. So they're either low-cost improvements from an operational standpoint or demand reduction standpoint. So that's really the focus of what we try to do, similar to what has been said earlier, trying to get the most out of the system we have before we add capacity. So I do want to touch on TSMO work within the state and within our region. So TxDOT has taken the lead, the Texas Department of Transportation. They took the lead several years ago to get the state on board looking at TSMO goals and objectives. Through that particular effort, they traveled around the state, they met with different regions, and their focus has been on these 6 elements: safety, reliability, efficiency, customer service, collaboration, and integration. From that work, every district then moved forward with developing TSMO plans. Within our region, we have 3 districts, Dallas, Fort Worth, and we have the Paris district. And so we had requested that we work on a comprehensive plan for the region, which TxDOT led with consultants helping us through the process. And as part of that plan, we had these programs that came out of it. So through our TSMO plan, we identify the types of programs we'd want to implement, not necessarily specific locations of where those projects would be implemented. So these focus areas were traffic incident management, work zone management, road weather management, special events, traffic signals, and then just general traffic management type strategies. So what we have tried to do within our metropolitan area is we link this TSMO plan where we identify different programs to our congestion management process. So the state and the district's TSMO plans identify programs. We take those programs, we go through our congestion management process, and then we identify specific projects that can be implemented on specific corridors based on the needs of those corridors. Again, we're trying to focus on how do we get the most out of the existing system we have by looking at operational and demand reduction strategies. That's really the gist behind the CMP, which is really a lot of the focus on this next slide of why we do a congestion management process as part of a planning process we do for the region. So obviously we want to try to get folks out of their cars and not drive by themselves to and from work and to other events. We want to make sure our signals are operated efficiently. We want to make sure our transportation system is safe for the users, one, to reduce the crashes, and which then cause delay and causes air quality implications. And then we also want to maximize the transportation funds that we have. So these types of strategies, as been mentioned, are lower cost, so they're a lot less expensive to put in place, and they have a good benefit for when you put them in place in the right corridors. And then obviously within our region we have a lot of partners that we coordinate with, and they have to help us implement these strategies. So COG does not operate anything in the region, but we fund our partner agencies to implement these strategies, and we work with them to implement them and measure the effectiveness of them. So I'm just going to walk you through kind of our process we use in the congestion management side that really gets us to allow us to engage TSMO in the process and mainstream it in some of the planning exercises, the congestion management process that we actually do. So in the congestion management process that we recently completed, we have 2 main areas that we look at by corridor. So we break our our limited access facilities around the region into corridor segments, and we look at performance criteria of those segments, and we also look at available assets. So the performance criteria that we focus on are crash rate, travel time index, travel time reliability, and we also add in their pavement and bridge conditions. Because if a corridor has poor pavement and bridge conditions, maybe it's time to reconstruct that corridor as part of this process. And then roadway infrastructure, this green box down here focuses on multiple infrastructure. The first box is roadway infrastructure, but what we want to see is what assets are out there, so then we can balance the demand or the need for that corridor. Maybe we're not utilizing all of our assets out there, so that's really where this bottom green box comes in, is looking at assets, and can we take the performance above, balance it across options on the corridor, and maybe we don't have to do a lot of other projects along the corridor. We just have to educate the users of what options are out there. So in this particular area, we look at roadway infrastructure, so parallel arterials, frontage roads, parallel freeways that are within a certain distance that might be good alternate routes for people to take. We also look at modal options, so we bring transit into this. We look at park and ride facilities, commuter rail, light rail, as well as bus. So in the bus aspect, we don't just focus on if the route's there. The route is one item, but also the frequency of the bus service that's provided along that particular corridor. And then we also look at operational assets. So are there shoulders along that freeway that allow for broken down vehicles to move off to the shoulder? Is there ITS deployed so that we can respond quickly to crashes and share that video with our tow truck operators and our first responders? Are there managed lanes or HOVs that we could open up those lanes when crashes occur, or we can dynamically price those lanes to get more people to change their behavior, possibly to ride together as a high occupant vehicle rather than a single vehicle? And then truck lane restrictions, we do have some of those within our region that help have a more consistent speed along a particular corridor. So from there, we move into these corridor statements, and then we also look at this corridor is going under construction. If it is, we feel that that construction type project should help solve these deficiencies we've identified. So we'll hold off on doing anything else on that particular segment until that construction's done and we've had a chance to get new data and reevaluate the corridor. So then we get the CMP output, which fall into sufficient, meaning that the performance measures, there's no deficiencies in the performance measures. The corridor is under construction. And then we have this area called CMP strategy candidate. These are the ones where we dig a little deeper and see what type of TSMO strategies we can implement to help improve the performance of that particular segment. And then some corridors are bad in every performance criteria, and those move into a more detailed corridor study that you look at a lot more detail, and they go through more of a NEPA type process. So the output for our CMP look like this. A lot of our corridors have construction that's going on, and then the ones in orange are our CMP corridors that we are looking at closer with our partner agencies to identify what types of strategies that we have along that. And then any that fell into bad, poor bridge and pavement conditions, we put those down as a rehab project that we send back to the districts to try to get maintenance money to help improve the bridge and pavement conditions along that corridor. So as we identify these corridors in the orange, we move into this next step where we dig a little deeper into what's happening on the corridor and what deficiencies there are. So we have our performance criteria here, and the items in red are ones that are in the top 25% of these performance criteria. And so we use that to identify, okay, for example, travel time reliability, we're looking at more non-recurring congestion in that standpoint. So what types of things can we start to look to utilize as part of that non-recurring congestion problem that we might have? The second segment here is deficient in 3 of the areas. And so that's one that we have multiple things we need to look at, versus segment 3, we have 2, crash rate as well as travel time reliability, which those kind of go in sync with one another, and it makes sense to have that. And then we do the score for each by roadway infrastructure, the parallel arterials, frontage roads, parallel freeways. Green means we have a lot of options within that. The yellow is medium type coverage, and if they're not highlighted at all, it means there's very little coverage or options for people to take that other alternate route. The same thing applies for our modal options. So the park and ride facilities, light rail, commuter rail. I talked about the bus routes versus the bus density. So bus routes is, do they have routes that are parallel to the corridor, and density is the frequency of that service that's provided along that corridor. And so these are the things that we look at. Again, the green is the higher, and then yellow, there are no yellows on this one, or medium, and if they're not highlighted, then they're low. So again, we want to utilize these assets that are out there. The next slide looks at operational assets, so our shoulders, our ITS, our truck lane restrictions. So most of our corridors in our region do have ITS coverage within the region. We're about 90% covered for our limited access facilities. We do have a lot of corridors, though, that have restricted shoulders, and so this is common along some of our corridors, especially our construction corridors, and we've talked about maybe how we do other strategies in some of those that help with staging of tow truck operators and things like that, so we can get crashes off the roadway or stranded motorists off the roadway pretty quickly so they're not impeding traffic. So from there, we take it further and we come up with these corridor summary statements that identify where things are sufficient and where there's high and medium infrastructure that's out there to better utilize and balance that demand on the particular corridor. So from there, after we identify these corridors that fall into our CMP strategies, we begin to break these corridor segments into even smaller segments to truly identify the problem. Is it a bottleneck problem, or is there some geometric design problem that's causing the crashes along that particular corridor? And it allows us to identify specific strategies that we can implement along the corridor, and then we work with our partner agencies to get those added to our transportation improvement program. So as part of this process, we really focus on these different groups and engaging these different groups in this process, which allows us to educate them on TSMO type of activities and projects that exist out there, and learn from them when we bring in some of our demand reduction type groups, our bike and pedestrian groups. They have innovative solutions for bike and pedestrian type safety projects, and so they really bring to the table some of their expertise. So when we start this initial process of looking at these segments in more detail, we bring groups in from across our department to help us identify possible strategies and understand what we can do along the corridor to improve operations. So we really try to mainstream this particular process in TSMO into these groups as we talk through the corridor needs with them. So we have our bike ped group, we have a transit group that is part of it, our travel demand management group, asset management, as well as safety. From there, we then go out to our external partners and start having conversations with them about what types of strategies would be useful to implement along the corridor, and they can support implementing along the corridor. For example, dynamic pricing can't necessarily be put anywhere in the region, and so we have to make sure that our partners are interested in that, and we can actually implement it based on what legislation and other policies are in place. So there's strategies that sometimes we want to do, but we really have to have our partners on board, and it has to be something that's legislatively feasible for us to implement. And that's where we get to the strategy identification to be implemented. So a few things that we do when we dig into the corridors a little further is so this graphic, we've used NRICS data here, and this is looking at by direction, by time of day, and the speeds. So you can see when we look at it from a corridor, the entire corridor level, it does have the AM and the PM dips But when you look at it by the highest segment, you see how this dip lasts a lot longer in these southbound directions than it did in the entire segment, because it kind of dilutes the data to some extent when you look at it for an entire corridor. So we utilize this process to identify corridors with problems, and then we keep digging deeper and deeper and deeper into the data until we can identify what is exactly the problem and where is it located and what strategy can we implement to help solve that problem. This is another example of what we use, our heat maps by time of day. This as well gives you an idea of an entire corridor versus the highest segment and the actual impact. So the entire corridor, it has this PM peak here, but you can see a lot more detail, and the extent of it is a lot worse when you break out the highest segment. Again, allowing us to look at the detail so we can make sure that we implement projects that help solve the actual problem out there on the corridor. This slide shows the identification of strategies, and so what we do here is we've identified all types of strategies, kind of like our toolbox of strategies that we use, and then we look at performance measures, performance measures that need improvement. So the corridors that fall into the improvements are needed on travel time reliability or travel time index. We're going to look at signal type options, and then they also have frontage roads and parallel arterials. So we look at performance measures and primary and secondary assets, and that helps us narrow down what strategies we need to focus on and weed through with our partners to determine what might be best for that particular corridor. So this process just gives us another opportunity or tool that helps us narrow down that selection rather than looking at 100 different strategies that could be implemented. It would narrow it down to more of a manageable amount of like 20 different strategies that then the group can talk through and determine how to move forward with those particular strategies. I guess it might have been, maybe it said you could use the play option. Maybe I had hit something accidentally. So as we select the strategies, oh, there, I don't know what that, as we select the strategies using the performance criteria and the available assets, that's really, what we do in terms of moving through this review process. So we review the strategies. We also look for any upcoming funded projects on the corridor. Then we group these selected strategies into a program of projects, and we identify the implementing agency. As I mentioned, COG doesn't necessarily operate any infrastructure out there, so we rely on our partner agencies to implement that strategies. And then we take this as a program of projects to our technical and our policy board for approval. And then we do go out and look at the effectiveness of these strategies. Again, we want to know how well and effective these strategies were that we implemented based on the characteristics of the corridor. So this is kind of where the process starts all over again. We evaluate the effectiveness. We know how those strategies work for those types of corridors. And then we start our evaluation process kind of at the beginning of where the presentation started. And we just continue this cycle to understand and improve the operations of our transportation system. And that is my last slide. So I'll turn it back over to Pat.